Hi. So, welcome to reading with me. Yeah. And I have, of course, nourishment. And of course, there's nothing to read if there's no book. So, today we are going to read King of Scars by Leigh Bardugo. And this is the very first Leigh Bardugo book that I'm going to read. Of course, so that'll be the very first book from the Grishaverse that I'll be reading. I've never read a single one because I never really had an opportunity to. My sister is a big fan. She read Six of Crows and Shadow and Bone, I believe. But and then she told me about the Netflix series, and I was like, I loved it. I was amazed. And she said, from someone who already read the book and watched the series, she was like, the series is really good. So I was like, I want to read something. And from the recommendations of the book list that I got, this is the one that I got the most interested with. Maybe because of the influence of my sister, and also because, why not? She's been raved about like crazy lots. So, hope you enjoy this with me. Okay, let's be cozy. Alright, let's start. I think I will be skipping. There's no preface? Okay. For Morgan Fahey, wartime general, peacetime consigliere, and dearest friend, mostly benevolent queen. Apparently, don't even know who they are. Oh, so apparently there's the Grisha, soldiers of the Second Army, masters of the small science. There's the Corporalki, the Heartrenders, the Healers, the Etherealki, the Order of Summoners. Oh, so Corporalki is the Order of the Living and the Dead, which is the Heartrenders and the Healers. And there's the Etherealki, the Order of Summoners, which is the Squallers, Inferni, or Inferni, and the Tidemakers, and the Materialki, the Order of Fabricators, which is the Durasts and the Alchemy. Oh my gosh. You guys see? This is the map. I'll probably have the map maybe seen here in the video if I see a picture. So we see here Dravka, the Fierda, Novi Zem, Shuhan, Kerch. This is a really cool map. Takes me back to like reading Lord of the Rings. It's nice. Alright, so King of Scars. The Drowning Man. That's the very first chapter, I believe. Oh no, sorry. That's not the first chapter. This is the Drowning Man. First one, Dima. Dima heard the barn door slam before anyone else did. Inside the little farmhouse, the kitchen bubbled like a pot on the stove. Its windows shut tight against the storm, the air in the room warm and moist. The walls rattled with the rowdy din of Dima's brothers talking over one another, as his mother hummed and thumped her flute to a song Dima didn't know. She held the torn sleeve of one of his father's shirt taut in her lap, her needle pecking at the fabric in the uneven rhythm of an eager sparrow, a skein of wool thread trailing between her fingers like a choice worm. Dima was the youngest of 6 boys, the baby who had arrived late to his mother, long after the doctor who came through their village every summer had told her there would be no more children. An unexpected blessing, Mama liked to say, holding Dima close and fussing over him when the others had gone off to their chores. An unwanted mouth to feed, his older brother Peter would sneer. Is it Peter? Maybe it's Peter. Peter? Because Dima was so small, he was often left out of his brother's jokes, forgotten in the noisy arguments of the household, and that was why on that autumn night, standing by the basin, soaping the last of the pots that his brothers had made sure to leave for him, only he heard the damning thunk of the barn doors. Dima set to scrubbing harder. determined to finish his work and get to bed before anyone could think to send him out into the dark. He could hear their dog, Molnia, whining on the kitchen stoop, begging for scraps and a warm place to sleep as the wind rose on an angry howl. Branches lashed the windows. Mamma lifted her head, the grim furrows around her mouth deepening. She scowled as if she could send the wind to bed without supper. Winter comes early and stays too long. Said Papa, like her mother. Mamma gave him a kick with her boot. She left a little glass of kvass behind the stove that night, a gift for the household ghosts who watched over the farm and who slept behind the old iron stove to keep warm. Or so Mamma said. Papa only rolled his eyes and complained it was a waste of good kvass. Dima knew that when everyone had gone to bed, Peter would slurp it down and eat a slice of honey cake Mamma left wrapped in cloth. Great-grandma's ghost will haunt you, Dima sometimes warned. But Peter would just wipe his sleeve across his chin and say, "There is no ghost, you little idiot. Baba Galina was lunch for the cemetery worms, and the same thing will happen to you if you don't keep your mouth shut." Now Peter leaned down and gave Dima a hard jab. Dima often wondered if Peter did special exercises to make his elbow more pointy. "Do you hear that?" his brother asked. "There's nothing to hear," said Dima as his heart sunk. The barn door. Something's out there riding the storm. So his brother was just trying to scare him. Don't be stupid, Dima said, but he was relieved. "Listen," said Peter, and as the wind shook the roof of the house and the fire sputtered in the grate, Dima thought he heard something more than the storm. A high, distant cry like the yowl of a hungry animal or the wailing of a child. When the wind blows through the graveyard, it wakes the spirits of all the babies who died before they could be given their saint's name, Malenki. They go looking for souls to steal so they can barter their ways into heaven. Peter leaned down and poked his finger into Dima's shoulder. They always take the youngest. Dima was 8 now, old enough to know better, but still his eyes strayed to the dark windows out to the moonlit yard, where the trees bowed and shook in the wind. He flinched. He could have sworn just for a moment. He could have sworn he saw a shadow streak across the yard, the dark blot of something much larger than a bird. Peter laughed and splashed him with soapy water. "I swear, you get more witless with every passing day. Who would want your little nothing of a soul?" "Peter is only angry because, before you, he was the baby," Mama always told Dima. "You must try to be kind to your brother even when he is older, but not wiser." Dima tried. He truly did. But sometimes he just wanted to knock Peter on his bottom and see how he liked feeling small. The wind dropped, and in the sudden gust of silence there was no disguising the sharp slam that echoed across the yard. "Who left the barn doors open?" Papa asked. "It was Dima's job to see to the stalls tonight," Peter said, virtuously, and his brothers gathered around the table, clucked like flustered hens. "I closed it," protested Dima. "I set the bar fast." Papa leaned back in his chair. "Then do I imagine that sound?" "He probably thinks a ghost did it," said Peter. Mama looked up from her mending. "Dima, you must go close and bar the doors." "I will do it," said Peter with a resigned sigh. We all know Dima is afraid of the dark, but Dima sensed this was a test. Papa would expect him to take responsibility. "I am not afraid," he said. "Of course I will go close the doors." Dima ignored Peter's smug look. He wiped his hands and put on his coat and hat. Mama handed him a tin lantern. "Hurry now," she said, pushing up his collar to keep his neck warm. "Scurry back and I'll tuck you in and tell you a story." "A new one?" "Yes, and a good one. About the mermaids of the north. Does it have magic in it?" "Plenty. Go on now." Dima cast his eyes once to the icon of Sankt Felix on the wall by the door, candlelight flickering over his sorrowful face, his gaze full of sympathy, as if he knew just how cold it was outside. Felix had been impaled on a spit of apple boughs and cooked alive just after he'd performed the miracle of the orchards. He hadn't screamed or cried, only suggested that the villagers turned him so the flames could reach his other side. Felix wouldn't be afraid of a storm. As soon as Dima opened the kitchen door, the wind tried to snatch it from his grip. He slammed it behind him and heard the latch turn from the other side. He knew it was temporary, a necessity, but he still felt like he was being punished. He looked back at the glowing windows as he forced his feet down the steps to the dry scrabble of the yard, and had the awful thought that as soon as he left the warmth of the kitchen, his family had forgotten him, that if he never returned, no one would cry out or raise the alarm. The wind would wipe Dima from their memory. He considered the long moonlit stretch he would have to traverse past the chicken coops and the goose shed to the barn, where they sheltered their old horse, Gerasim, and their cow, Mathilde. Mathilde? Faced with steel saw blades, he whispered, brushing his hand over the new plow as he passed, as if it were a lucky talisman. He wasn't sure why the blades were better, but when the plow had arrived, those were the words his father had proudly repeated to their neighbors, and Dima liked the strong sound of them. There had been long arguments at the kitchen table about the plow, along with all the king's agricultural reforms and what trouble or hope they might bring. "We're on our way to another civil war," Mama had grumbled. "The king is too rash." But Papa was pleased. "How can you worry with your belly full at the roof patched with fresh tar? This was the first year we were able to harvest enough of our crops to sell at market instead of just keeping ourselves fed. Because the king cut Duke Radimov's thigh to a scrap of what it was," Mum exclaimed. "And we should be sorry? We will be when the Duke and his noble friends murder the king in his bed." King Nikolai is a war hero," said Papa, waving his hand through the air as if trouble could be banished like pipe smoke. "There will be no coup without the army to back it." They talked in circles, debating the same things night after night. Dima didn't understand much of it, only that he was to keep the young king in his prayers. The geese honked and rustled in their shed, riled by the weather or Dima's nervous footsteps as he passed. Ahead, he saw the big wooden barn door swaying open and shut as if the building were sighing, as if the doorway were a mouth that might suck him in with a single breath. He liked the barn in the daytime, when sunlight fell through the slats of the roof and everything was hay smells. Gerasim's snorting, Matilda's disapproving moo, but at night the barn became a hollow shell, waiting for some terrible creature to fill it, some cunning thing that might let the doors blow open to lure a foolish boy outside. Because Dima knew he had closed those doors. He felt certain of it, and he could not help but think of Peter's Malenki, little ghost hunting for a soul to steal. "Stop it," Dima scolded himself. "Peter unbarred the doors himself just so you would have to go out in the cold or shame yourself by refusing." But Dima had shown his brothers and his father he could be brave, and that thought warmed him even as he yanked his collar up around his ears and shivered at the bite of the wind. Only then did he realize he couldn't hear Molnia barking anymore. She hadn't been by the door, trying to nose her way into the kitchen, when Dima ventured outside. "Molnia?" he said, and the wind seized his voice, casting it away. "Molnia!" he called, but only a bit louder, in case something other than his dog was out there listening. Step by step, he crossed the yard, the shadows from the trees leaping and shuddering over the ground. Beyond the woods, he could see the wide ribbon of the road. It led all the way to the town, all the way to the churchyard. Diba did not let his eyes follow it. It was too easy to imagine some shambling body dressed in ragged clothes traveling that road, trailing clods of cemetery earth behind it. He heard a soft whine from somewhere in the trees. Dima shrieked. Yellow eyes stared back at him from the dark. The glow from his lantern fell on black paws, ruffled fur, bared teeth. "Molnia!" he said on a relieved sigh. He was grateful for the loud moan of the storm. The thought of his brothers hearing his high, shameful yelp and running outside just to find their poor dog cowering in the brush was too horrible to contemplate. "Come here, girl," he coaxed. Molnia had pressed her belly to the ground, her ears flat against her head. She did not move. Dima looked back at the barn. The plank that should have laid across the doors and kept them in place lay smashed to bits in the brush. From somewhere inside, he heard a soft, wet snuffling. Had the wounded animal found its way into the barn? Or a wolf? The golden light of the farmhouse windows seemed impossibly far away. Maybe he should go back and get help. Surely he couldn't be expected to face a wolf by himself. But what if there was nothing inside? Or some harmless cat that Molnia had gotten a piece of? Then all his brothers would laugh, not just Peter. Dima shuffled forward, keeping his lantern far out in front of him. He waited for the storm to quiet and grabbed the heavy door by its edge so it would not strike him as he entered. The barn was dark. The barn was dark, barely touched by slats of moonlight. Dima edged a little deeper into the blackness. He thought of Sankt Felix's gentle eyes, the thorny apple bow piercing his heart. Then, as if the storm had just been catching his breath, the wind lipped. The doors behind Dima slammed shut, and the weak light of his lantern sputtered to nothing. Outside, he could hear the storms raging, but the barn was quiet. The animals had gone silent as if waiting, and he could smell their sour fear over the sweetness of hay and something else. Dima knew that smell from when they slaughtered the geese for the holiday table, the hot copper tang of blood. Go back, he told himself. In the darkness, something moved. Dima caught a glint of moonlight, the shine of what might have been eyes, and then it was as if a piece of shadow broke away and came sliding across the barn. Dima took a step backward, clutching the useless lantern to his chest. The shadow bore the shredded remains of what might have once been fine clothes, and for a brief, hopeful moment, Dima thought a traveler had stumbled into the barn to sleep out the storm, but it did not move like a man. It was too graceful, too silent, its body unwinding in a low crouch. Dima whimpered as the shadow prowled closer. Its eyes were mirror black, and dark veins spread from its clawed fingertips as if its hands had been dipped in ink. The tendrils of shadow tracing its skin seemed to pulse. Run, Dima told himself. Scream! He thought of the way the geese came to Pyotr so trustingly, how they made no sound of protest in the scant seconds before his brothers broke their necks. Stupid, Dima had thought at that time, but now he understood. The thing rose from its hunches, a black silhouette and two vast wings unfurled from its back, their edges curling like smoke. Papa! Dima tried to cry, but the word came out as little more than a puff of breath. The thing paused as if the word was somehow familiar. It listened, head cocked to the side, and Dima took another step backward, then another. The monster's eyes snapped to Dima, and the creature was suddenly bare inches away, looming over him. With the grey moonlight falling over its body, Dima could see that the dark stains around its mouth and on its chest were blood. The creature leaned forward, inhaling deeply. Up close, he had the features of a young man, until its lips parted, the corners of its mouth pulling back to reveal long black fangs. It was smiling. The monster was smiling, because it knew it would soon be well fed. Dima felt something warm slide down his legs and realized he had wet himself. The monster lunged. The doors behind Dima blew open, the storm demanding entry. A loud crack sounding as the gust knocked the creature from its clawed feet and hurled its winged body against the far wall. The wooden beams splintered with the force, and the thing slumped to the floor in a heap. A figure strode into the barn in a drab grey coat, a strange wind lifting her long black hair. The moon caught her features, and Dima cried harder. Because she was too beautiful to be any ordinary person, and that meant she must be a saint. He had died, and she had come to escort him to the bright lands, but she did not stoop to take him in her arms or speak soft prayers or words of comfort. Instead, she approached the monster, hands held out before her. She was a warrior saint, then, like Sanct Juris, like Sancta Alina of the Fold. Be careful, Dima managed to whisper, afraid she would be harmed. It has such teeth. But his saint wasn't afraid. She nudged the monster with the toe of her boot and rolled it into its side. The creature snarled as it came awake, and Dima clutched his lantern tighter as if it might become a shield. In a few swift movements, the saint had secured the creature's clawed hands in heavy shackles. She yanked hard on the chain, forcing the monster to its feet. It snapped its teeth at her, but she did not scream or cringe. She swatted the creature on its nose as if it were a misbehaving pet. The thing hissed, pulling futilely on its restraints. Its wings swept, once, twice, trying to lift her off her feet, but she gripped the chain in her fist and thrust her other hand forward. Another gust of wind struck the monster, slamming it into the barn wall. It hit the ground, fell to its knees, stumbled back up, weaving and unsteady in a way that made it seem curiously human, like Papa when he had been out late at the tavern. The saint tugged on the chain. She murmured something, and the creature hissed again as the wind eddied around them. Not a saint, Dima realized. Grisha, a soldier of the Second Army, a squaller who could control wind. She took the shawl from her shoulders and tossed it over the creature's head and shoulders, leading her captured prey past Dima, the monster still struggling and snapping. She tossed Dima a silver coin. For the damage, she said, her eyes bright as jewels in the moonlight. You saw nothing tonight, understood? Hold your tongue, or next time I won't keep him on his leash. Dima nodded. Feeling fresh tears spill down his cheeks, the Grisha raised a brow. He had never seen a face like her, more lovely than any painted icon, blue eyes like the deepest waters of the river. She tossed him another coin, and he just managed to snatch it from the air. That's one's for you. Don't share it with your brothers. Dima watched as she sailed through the barn doors. He forced his feet to move. He wanted to return to the house, find his mother, and burn himself in her skirts, but he was desperate for one last look at the Grisha and her monster. He trailed after them as silently as he could. In the shadows of the moonlight road, a large coach waited, its driver cloaked in black. A coachman jumped down and seized the chain, helping to drag the creature inside. Dima knew he must be dreaming, despite the cool weight of silver in his palm, because the coachman did not look at the monster and say, "Go on, you beast, or you'll never trouble these people again," as a hero would in a story. Instead, in the deep shadows cast by the swaying pines, Dima thought he heard the coachman said, "Wash your head, your highness." What? Oh my gosh, that was so cool. I'm sorry, I have to drink tea. And that is freaking hot tea. Oh my gosh. Ugh, that tastes really good. Okay. That was so cool. Wait, so the monster was oh my gosh. Okay. Next, chapter 2. And now I get why audiobooks take 10 hours. I we're in 20 minutes and this is only chapter 1. Alright. Chapter 2. Zoya. The stink of blood hung heavy in the coach. Zoya pressed her sleeve to her nose to ward off the smell, but the musty odor of dirty wool wasn't much improvement. Vile. It was bad enough that she had to go tearing off across the Ravkan countryside in the dead of the night in a borrowed, badly sprung coach, but that she had to do so in a garment like this? Unacceptable. She stripped the coat from her body. The stench still clung to the silk of her embroidered blue kafta beneath, but she felt a bit more like herself now. They were 10 miles outside Yvette's, nearly 100 miles from the safety of the capital, racing along the narrow roads that would lead them back to the estate of their host for the trade summit. Duke Radimov. Zoya wasn't much for praying, so she could only hope no one had seen Nikolai escape his chambers and take to the skies. If they'd been back home, back in Os-Alta, this never would have happened. She thought they'd taken enough precautions. She couldn't have been more wrong. The horse's hooves thundered, the wheels of the coach clattering and jouncing as beside her the king of Ravka gnashed his needle-sharp teeth and pulled at his chains. Zoya kept her distance. She'd seen what one of Nikolai's bites could do when he was in this state. She had no interest in losing a limb or worse. Part of her had wanted to ask Tolia or Tamar, the brother and sister who served as the king's personal guards, to ride inside a carriage with her until Nikolai resumed his human form. Their father had been a shrew mercenary who had trained them to fight, their mother a Grisha, from whom they both inherited heartrender gifts. The presence of either twin would have been welcome, but her pride prevented it, and she also knew what it would cost the king. One witness to his misery was bad enough. Outside the wind howled. It was less the baying of a beast than the high, wild laugh of an old friend driving them on. The wind did what she willed it, had since she was a child. Yet on nights like this she couldn't help but feel that it was not her servant but her ally. A storm that rose to mask a creature's snarls, to hide the sounds of a fight in a rickety barn, to whip up trouble in streets and village taverns. This was the western wind, Adescu, the mischief maker, a worthy companion. Even if that farm boy told everyone in Yvette's what he'd seen, the townspeople would chalk it up to Adescu, the rascal wind that drove women to their neighbors' beds and made mad. Thoughts skitter in men's heads like whirls of dead leaves. A mile later, the snarls in the coach had quieted. The clanking of the chains dwindled as the creature seemed to sink farther and farther into the shadows of the seat. At last, a voice hoarse and beleaguered said, "I don't suppose you brought me a fresh shirt?" I wonder what his accent's like. Zoya took the pack from the coach floor and pulled out a clean white shirt and fur-lined coat, both finely made but thoroughly rumpled, appropriate attire for a royal who had spent the night carousing. Without a word, Nikolai held up his shackled wrists. The talons had retracted, but his hands were still scarred with the faint black lines he had worn since the end of the Civil War 3 years ago. The king often wore gloves to hide them, and Zoya thought that was a mistake. The scars were a reminder of the torture he had endured at the hands of the Darkling, and the price he had paid alongside his country. Of course, that was only part of the story, but it was the part of the Ravkan people were best equipped to handle. Zoya unlocked the chains with the heavy key she wore around her neck. She hoped it was her imagination, but the scars on Nikolai's hands seemed darker lately, as if determined not to fade. Once his hands were free, the king peeled the ruined shirt from his body. He used the linen and water from the flask she had handed him to wash the blood from his chest and mouth, then splashed more over his hands and ran them through his hair. The water trickled down his neck and shoulders. He was shaking badly, but he looked like Nikolai again. Hazel eyes, clear, the damp gold of his hair pushed back from his forehead. "Where did you find me this time?" he asked, keeping most of the tremor from his voice. Zoya wrinkled her nose at the memory. "A goose farm. I hope it was one of the more fashionable goose farms." He fumbled with the buttons of his clean shirt, fingers still shaking. "Do we know what I killed? Or who?" The question hung unspoken in the air. Zoya batted Nikolai's quaking hands away from his buttons and took up the work herself. Through the thin cotton, she could feel the chill the night had left on his skin. "What an excellent valet you make," he murmured. But she knew he hated submitting to these small attentions, hated that he was weak enough to require them. Sympathy would only make it worse, so she kept her voice brusque. "I presume you killed a great deal of geese, possibly a shaggy pony, but that had been all?" Zoya had no way of knowing what the monster might have got into before they'd found him. "You remember nothing?" "Only flashes. They would just have to wait for any reports of death or mutilations." The trouble had begun 6 months earlier, when Nikolai had woken in a field nearly 30 miles from Os Alta, bloodied and covered in bruises, with no memory of how he'd gotten out of the palace or what he'd done in the night. "I seem to have taken up sleepwalking," he declared to Zoya and to the rest of the Grisha triumvirate when he'd sauntered in late to their morning meeting, a long scratch down his cheek. They'd been concerned, but baffled. Tolya and Tamar were hardly the type to just let Nikolai slip by. "How did you get past them?" Zoya asked. As Ganya tailored away the scratch and David carried on about somnambulism. But if Nikolai had been troubled, he hadn't shown it. "I excel at most things," he'd said. "Why not unlikely escapes too?" He'd had new locks placed on his bedroom doors and insisted they move on to the business of the day and the odd report of an earthquake in Revost that had released thousands of silver hummingbirds from a crack in the earth. A little over a month later, Tolya had been reading in a chair outside the king's bedchamber when he'd heard the sound of breaking glass and burst through the door to see Nikolai leap from the window ledge. Why did I say knowledge? From the window ledge, his back split by wings of curling shadow. Tolya had woken Zoya and they tracked the king to the roof of a granary 15 miles away. After that, they had started chaining the king to his bed, an effective solution, workable only because Nikolai's servants were not permitted inside his palace bedchamber. The king was a war hero, after all, and known to suffer nightmares. Zoya had locked him in every night since and released him every morning, and they'd kept Nikolai's secret safe. Only Tolya, Tamar, and the triumvirate knew the truth. If anyone discovered the king of Ravka spent his nights dressing up in chains, he'd be a perfect target for assassination or coup, not to mention a laughingstock. That was what made travel so dangerous. But Nikolai couldn't stay sequestered behind the walls of Os Alta forever. A king cannot remain locked up in his own castle, he declared when he decided to resume travel away from the palace. One risks looking less like a monarch and more like a hostage. "You have emissaries to manage these matters of state," Zoya had argued, "ambassadors, underlings. The public may forget how handsome I am. I doubt it. Your face is on the money." Nikolai had refused to relent, and Zoya could admit he wasn't entirely wrong. His father had made the mistake of letting others conduct the business of ruling, and it had cost him. There was a balance to be struck, she supposed, between caution and daring, tiresome as compromise tended to be. Life just ran more smoothly when she got her way. Because Nikolai and Zoya couldn't very well travel with a trunk full of chains for inquisitive servants to discover, whenever they were away from the safety of the palace, they relied on a powerful sedative to keep Nikolai tucked into bed and the monster at bay. "Genya will have to mix my tonic stronger," he said now, shrugging into his coat. "Or you could stay in the capital and insist taking these foolish risks." So far, the monster had been content with the tax on livestock, his casualties limited to gutted sheep and drained cattle, but they both knew it was only a question of time. Whatever the Darkling's power had left seething within Nikolai hungered for more than animal flesh. The last incident was barely a week ago. He grabbed the hand over his face. I thought I had more time. It's getting worse. I like to keep you on your toes, Nazialensky. Constant anxiety does wonders for the complexion. I'll send you a thank you card. Make sure of it. You're positively glowing. He's fearing worse and he's letting on, thought Zoya. Nikolai was always freer with compliments when he was fatigued. It was true. She did look splendid, even after a harrowing night. But Zoya knew the king couldn't care less about her appearance. They heard a sharp whistle from outside as the carriage slowed. We're approaching the bridge, Zoya said. The trade summit in Yvetz had been essential to their negotiations with the nations of Kerch and Novi Zem, but the business of tariffs and taxes had also provided cover for their true mission, a visit to the site of Ravka's latest supposed miracle. A week ago, the villagers of Yvetz had set out to behind Duke Radimov's ribbon-festooned cart to celebrate the festival of Sankt Grigory, banging drums and playing little harps meant to mimic the instrument Grigory had fashioned to soothe the beasts of the forests. Before his martyrdom, but when they reached the Obel, the wooden bridge that spanned the river gorge had given way. Before the Duke and his vassals could plummet to the raging white water below, another bridge had sprung up beneath them, seeming to bloom from the very walls of the chasm and the jagged rocks of the canyon floor, or so the reports had claimed. Zoya had put little stock in the tales, chalked them up to exaggeration, maybe even mass delusion, until she'd seen the bridge for herself. She peered out the coach window as they rounded the bend in the road and the bridge came into view, its tall, slender pillars and long girders gleaming white in the moonlight. Though she'd seen it before and walked its length with the king, the sight was still astonishing. From a distance, it looked like something wrought in alabaster. It was only when one drew closer that it became clear the bridge was not stone at all. Nikolai shook his head. As a man who regularly turns into a monster, I realized I shouldn't be making judgments about stability. But are we sure it's safe? Not at all, admitted Zoya, trying to ignore the knot in her stomach. When she'd crossed over it with the twins earlier that night, she'd been too focused on finding Nikolai to worry about this bridge holding up. But it's the only way across the gorge. Perhaps I should have brushed up on my prayers. The sound of the wheels changed as the coach rolled onto the bridge, from the rumble of the road to a steady thump, thump, thump. The bridge that had so miraculously sprung up from nothing was not stone or brick or wooden beam. Its white girders and transoms were bone and tendon, its abutments and piers bound together with ropey bundles of gristle. Thump, thump, thump. They were traveling over a spine. I don't care for that sound, said Zoya. Agreed. A miracle should sound more dignified. Some chimes, perhaps, or a choir of heavenly voices. Don't call it that, snapped Zoya. A choir? A miracle. Zoya had whispered enough futile prayers in her childhood to know the saints never answered. The bridge had to be a Grisha craft, and there was a rational explanation for its appearance, one she intended to find. What would you call a bridge made of bones appearing just in time to save an entire town from death? Asked Nikolai. It was an entire town. Half a town, he amended. An unexpected occurrence. The people might feel that description falls short of this marvel. And it was a marvel. At once elegant and grotesque, a mass of crossing beams and soaring arches. Since it had appeared, pilgrims had camped at either end of it, holding vigil day and night. They did not raise their heads as the coach rolled by. What would you call the earthquake in Ravost? Nikolai continued. Or the statue of Sancta Anastasia weeping tears of blood outside Tsesmna? Trouble, Zoya said. You still think it's the work of Grisha using Parim? How else could someone create such a bridge or an earthquake on demand? Jurda Parim. Zoya wished she'd never heard the words. The drug was the product of experimentation in a shoe lab. It could take a Grisha's power and transform it to something wholly new and wholly dangerous. But the price for that brief bit of glory was addiction and eventually death. It might make it possible for a rogue fabricator to shake the earth or for a corporalnik to make a bridge out of a body. But to what end? Could the shoe be using Grisha slaves to destabilize Ravka? Could the apparat, the supposed spiritual counselor to the crown, be involved? Thus far, he had only declared that he was praying over the incidents and planned to stage a pilgrimage to the sites. Zoya had never trusted the priest, and she had no doubt that if he could find a way to stage a miracle, he could also find a way to use the spectacle to his own advantage. But the real question, the question that had brought them to Yvetz, was whether the strange happenings around Ravka were tied to the dark power that sheltered inside Nikolai. The occurrences had begun right around the same time as Nikolai's night spells. It might be a coincidence, but they had come to Yvetz in the hope of finding some clue, some connection that would help them rid Nikolai of the monster's will. They reached the other side of the bridge, and the reassuringly ordinary rumble of the dirt road filled the coach once more. It was as if a spell had lifted. "We'll have to leave Duke Radimov today," said Nikolai, "and hope no one saw me flapping around the grounds." Zoya wanted to agree, but since they made a journey, "I can double your dose of Genghis tonic. There's another day left in negotiations. Let Ilyashin handle them. I want to go back to the capital. We have samples from the bridge for David. He may be able to learn something we can use to deal with my affliction." Uninvited guest. Zoya rolled her eyes. He spoke as if he were being plagued by Billy's aunt, but there was an important reason for them to stay in Yvette's. She had been wary of the trip, skeptical of the bridge, fearful of the risk, but had also known the trade summit presented them with a good opportunity. A certain Hiram Schenk and his two marriageable daughters. She tapped her fingers against the velvet seat, uncertain of how to proceed. She'd hoped to orchestrate a meeting between Nikolai and the Schenk girls without him realizing that she was meddling. The king did not like to be led, and when he sensed he was being pushed, he could be just as stubborn as, well, as Zoya herself. "Speak, Nazyalensky. When you purse your lips like that, you look like you've made love to a lemon." "Lucky lemon," Zoya said with a sniff. She smoothed the fabric of her kafta over her lap. "Hiram Schenk's family accompanied him to Yvette's, and he has two daughters." Nikolai laughed. "Is that why you agreed to this trip, so that you can indulge in your matchmaking?" "I agreed because someone has to make sure you don't eat anyone when your uninvited guest gets peckish in the middle of the night. And I am not some interfering mama who wants to see her darling son wed. I am trying to protect your throne. Hiram Schenk is a senior member of the Merchant Council. He could all but guarantee leniency on Ravka's loans from Kirch, to say nothing of the massive fortune one of his pretty daughters will inherit. How pretty? Who cares? Not me, certainly. But 2 years working with you has worn away my pride. I want to make sure I won't spend my life watching other men ogle my wife. If they do, you can have them beheaded. The man or my wife," said Nikolai. "Both. Just make sure to get her dowry first. Ruthless. Practical. If you stayed another night, Zoya, I can't very well court a bride if there's a chance I may turn her into dinner. You're a king. You don't have to court anyone. That's what the throne and the jewels and the title are for. And once you're married, your queen will become your ally. Or she may run screaming from her wedding bower and tell her father I began by nibbling on her earlobe and then tried to consume her actual ear. She could start a war. But she won't, Nikolai. Because by the time you two have said your vows, you'll have charmed her into loving you. And then you'll be her problem to take care of. Even my charm has its limits, Zoya." If so, she had yet to encounter them. Zoya cast the king a disbelieving glance. A handsome monster husband who put a crown on her head? It's a perfect fairy tale to sell to some starry-eyed girl. She can lock you in at night and kiss you sweetly in the morning, and Ravka will be secure. "Why do you never kiss me sweetly in the morning, Zoya?" "I do nothing sweetly, your highness." She shook out her cups. "Why do you hesitate? Until you marry, until you have an heir, Ravka will remain invulnerable." Nikolai's glib demeanor vanished. "I cannot take a wife while I'm in state. I cannot forge a marriage founded on lies. Aren't most, ever the romantic, ever practical? Kirch bridal prospects aside, we need to escape before Schneck can question me more closely about the Izmarsia." Zoya cursed. So the twins were right. There was a leak at our old research facility. The Izmarias were ships that traveled beneath the surface of the water. They would be vital to Ravka's survival as the Ferda navy grew, especially if Nikolai could arm them as he had planned. It seems so, but the Kirch don't know how far along we are, at least not yet. Those words did little to cheer Zoya. The Kirch already had enough leverage against Ravka. Schneck wouldn't have raised the topic of the Izmarzia with the king lightly. What did he intend to do with this new intelligence? Another sharp whistle sounded from outside the carriage. 2 quick notes. Toya signaled that they were approaching the gatehouse. Zoya knew there would be some confusion among the guards. No one had seen the coach ride out, and it bore no royal seal. Toya and Tamar had kept it at the ready well outside the Duke's estate just in case Nikolai slipped his leash. She had gone to find them as soon as she realized he was missing. They'd gotten lucky tonight. They'd found the king before he'd strayed too far. When Nikolai flew, Zoya could sense him riding the winds and use the disruption in their pattern to track his movements. But if she hadn't gone to that farm when she had, what might have happened? Would Nikolai have killed that boy? The thing inside him was not just a hungry animal, but something far worse, and she knew with absolute surety that it longed for human prey. We cannot go on this way, Nikolai. Eventually, they would be found out. Eventually, these evening hunts and sleepless nights would get the best of them. We must all do what is required. Nikolai sighed and opened his arms to her as the coach rattled to a stop. Then come here, Zoya, and kiss me sweetly as a new bride would. So much for propriety. Thanks to Zoya's late-night visits to make sure the king was safely restrained in his chambers, the gossip was already thick that their relationship was more than political. Kings took mistresses, and worse, things had been rumored about leaders before. Zoya just hoped the Schneck girls were the open-minded sort. If the king's reputation could withstand a bit of scandal, it would not survive the truth. Zoya took a second flask from the pack and dabbed whiskey at her pulse points like perfume before handing it to Nikolai, who took a long swig, then splashed the rest liberally over his coat. Zoya ruffled her hair, let her kefta slip from one shoulder, and eased into the king's arms. The charade was necessary, and it was an easier role to play, sometimes too easy. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. How did I smell like goose and cheap whiskey and you smell like you just ran through a meadow of wildflowers? Ruthlessness. He breathed it in again. What is that scent? It reminds me of something, but I can't place what. The last child you tried to eat? That must be it. The door to the coach flew open. Your Highness, we hadn't realized you got out tonight. Zoya couldn't see the guard's face, but she could hear the suspicion in his voice. Her king is not in the habit of asking for anything, least of all permission, said Nikolai, his voice lazy but with the disdainful edge of a monarch who knew nothing but easy gratification. Of course, said the guard. We had only your safety in mind, my king. Zoya doubted it. Western Ravka had brittled under the new taxes and laws that had come with unification. These guards might wear the double eagle, but their loyalty belonged to the Duke, who ran this estate and who had thrown up opposition to Nikolai's rule at every turn. No doubt their master would be thrilled to uncover the king's secrets. Zoya summoned her most plaintive tone and said, Why aren't we moving? She sensed a shift in their interest. A good night, then, said the guard, and she could almost see him peering to the coach to get a better look. Zoya tossed her long black hair and said with the sleepy, tousled sound of a woman well tumbled, A very good night. She'll only play with the royals, said the guard. She looks like fun. Zoya felt Nikolai tense. She was both touched and annoyed that he thought she cared what some buffoon believed, but there was no need to play at chivalry tonight. She cast the guard a long look and said, You have no idea. He chortled and waved them through. As the coach rolled on, Zoya felt the faint tremor of Nikolai's transformation still echoing through him and her own exhaustion creeping over her. It would be too easy to let her eyes close, to rest her head against his chest and give in to the illusion of comfort. But the price for such indulgence would be too high. Eventually the monster would be found out, she said. We've had no luck in finding a cure or even a hint of one. Marry, forge an alliance, make an heir, secure the throne and Ravka's future. I will, he said wearily. I'll do all of it, but not tonight. Tonight, let's pretend we're an old married couple. If any other man had said such a thing, she would have punched him in the jaw, or possibly taken him to bed for a few hours. And what does that entail? We'll tell each other lies as married couples do. It will be a good game. Go on, wife, tell me. I'm a handsome fellow who will never age and who will die with all of his own teeth in his head. Make me believe it. I will not. I understand. You've never had a talent for deception. So I knew he was goading her, but her pride pricked anyway. How can you be so sure? Perhaps the list of my talents is so long you just haven't got it to the end. Go on, then, Nazyalensky. Dearest husband, she said, making her voice honey-sweet, did you know the women of my family can see the future in the stars? You have to laugh. I did not. Oh yes, and I've seen your fate in the constellations. You will grow old, fat, and happy. Father many badly behaved children, and future generations will tell your story in legend and song. Very convincing, Nikolai said. You're good at this game. A long silence followed, filled with nothing but the rattling of the coach wheels. Now tell me, I'll find a way out of this. Tell me it will be all right. His tone was merry, teasing, but Zoya knew him too well. It will be all right, she said with all the conviction she could muster. We'll solve this problem as we've solved all the others before. She tilted her head up to look at him. His eyes were closed. A worried crease marred his brow. Do you believe me? Yes. She pushed away from him and straightened her clothes. Falsehoods were inevitable, maybe even necessary between a husband and wife. A general and her king could ill afford them. See, she said, you're good at this game too. I like them. They're cool. Okay. Let's have another drink. Chapter 3. Nina. Nina clutched her knife and tried to ignore the carnage that surrounded her. She looked down at her victim and other bodies played out helpless before her. "Sorry, friend," she murmured in Fierden. She drove her blade into the fish's belly, yanked up towards its head, seized the wet pink mess of its innards, and tossed them onto the filthy slats where they would be hosed away. The cleaned carcass went into a barrel to her left to be cleared by one of the runners and taken off for packaging, or processing, or pickling. Nina had no idea what actually happened to the fish, and she didn't much care. After 2 weeks working at a cannery overlooking the Ailing harbor, she didn't intend to eat anything with scales or fins ever again. Imagine yourself in a warm bath with a dish full of toffees. Maybe she'd just fill the bathtub with toffee and be really decadent about the endeavor. It could become quite the rage. Toffee baths and waffle scrubs. Nina gave her head a shake. This place was slowly driving her mad. Her hands were perpetually pruned, the skin nicked by tiny cuts from her clumsy way with a filleting knife. There we go. Filleting knife. The smell of fish never left her hair, and her back ached from being on her feet in front of the cannery from dawn until dusk, rain or shine, protected from the elements by nothing but a corrugated tin awning. But there weren't many jobs for unmarried women in Fierda, so Nina, under the name Mila Jandersdad, had gladly taken the position. The work was grueling but made it easy for their local contact to get her messages, and her vantage point among the fish barrels gave her a perfect view of the guards patrolling the harbor. There were plenty of them today, roaming the docks into their blue uniforms. Kalfisk, the locals called them, squid, because they had their tentacles and everything. Oh. Eiling sat where the Stelg River met the Isenvi, and it was one of the few harbors along Fjerda's rocky northwest coast with easy access to the sea for large vessels. The port was known for 2 things, smuggling and fish. Goldfish, monkfish, haddock, salmon, and sturgeon from the river cities to the east, sailfish and silver-sided king mackerel from the deep waters offshore. Nina worked beside 2 women, a Jesuit widow named Annabel and Marta, a spinster from Cherholm, who was as narrow as a gap in the floorboards and constantly shook her head as if everything displeased her. Their chatter helped to keep Nina distracted and was a welcome source of gossip and legitimate information, though it could be hard to tell the difference between the two. They say Captain Berger has a new mistress. Annabel would begin. Marta would purse her lips. With the bribes he takes, he can certainly afford to keep her. They're increasing patrols since those stowaways were caught. Marta would cluck her tongue. Means more jobs, but probably more trouble. More men in from Gulfwell today. Rivers gone sour up by the old fort. Marta's head would twitch back and forth like a happy dog's tail, a sign of jealous disfavor. Someone should send a priest to say prayers. Gulfwell, one of the river cities. Nina had never been there, had never even heard of it until she arrived with Adric and Leonie 2 months ago on orders from King Nikolai. But its name always left her uneasy. The sound of it accompanied by a kind of sighing inside her, as if the town's name was less a word than the start of an incantation. Now, Marta knocked the base of her knife against the wooden surface of her work table. Foreman coming. Hilbrand, the stern-faced foreman, was moving through the rows of stalls, calling out to runners to remove the buckets of fish. "Your pace is off again," he barked at Nina. "It's as if you've never gutted fish before." Imagine that. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "I'll do better." He got his hand through the hair. "Too slow. The shipment we've been waiting for has arrived. We'll move you to the packing room floor." "Yes, sir," Nina said glumly. She dropped her shoulders and hung her head when what she really wanted to do was break into song. The pay for packing jobs was considerably lower, so she had to make a good show for defeat. But she'd understood Hilbrand's real message. The last of the Grisha fugitives they'd been waiting for had made it to the Elling safe house at last. Now it was up to Nina, Adric, and Leonie to get to the 7 newcomers aboard the Verstoten. She followed close behind Hilbrand as he led her back toward the cannery. "You'll have to move quickly," he said without looking at her. "There's talk of a surprise inspection tonight." "All right, an obstacle, but nothing they couldn't handle." "There's more," he said. "Berger is on duty." Of course he is. Though that the surprise inspection was Captain Berger's idea. Of all the Kafisk, he was the most corrupt, but also the sharpest and most observant. If you wanted a legal shipment to get through the harbor without being trapped forever in customs, or if you wanted an illegal bit of cargo to avoid notice, then a bribe for a burger was the cost. A man without honor, said Matthias' voice in her head. Or Matthias? He should be ashamed. Nina snorted. If men were ashamed when they should be, they'd have no time for anything else. Is something amusing? Hildebrand asked, just finding a cold she lied. But even Hildebrand's gruff manner put a pang in her heart. He was broad-shouldered and humorless and reminded her painfully of Matthias. He's nothing like me. What a bigot you are, Nina Zenik. Not all Fairdens look alike. You know what Burger did to those always? Hildebrand said. I don't have to tell you to be careful. No, you don't, Nina said more sharply than she meant to. She was good at her job, and she knew exactly what was at stake. Her first morning at the docks, she'd seen Burger and one of his favorite thugs, Casper, drag a mother and daughter off a whaler bound for Novy Zem and beat them bloody. The captain had hung heavy chains around their necks, weighted with signs that read, Drush Witch. Then he doused them in a slurry of waste and fish guts from the canneries and bound them outside the harbor station in the blazing sun. As his men looked on, laughing, the stink and the promise full drew the gulls. Nina had spent her shift watching the women trying to shield her daughter's body with her own, and listening to the prisoners cry out in agony as she gulls-pecked and clawed at her bodies. Her mind had spun 1,000 fantasies of murdering Burger's harbor guards where they stood, of whisking the mother and daughter to safety. She could steal a boat. She could force the ship's captain to take them far away. She could do something. But she'd remember too clearly Zoya's warning to King Nikolai about Nina's suitability for a deep cover mission. She doesn't have a subtle bone in her body. Asking Nina not to draw attention is like asking water not to run downhill. The king had taken a chance on Nina, and she would not squander the opportunity. She would not jeopardize the mission. She would not compromise her cover and put Adric and Leon at risk. At least not in broad daylight. As soon as the sun had set, she'd slip back to the harbor to free the prisoners. They were gone. But to where? And to suffer what horrors? She no longer believed that the worst terror awaiting Grisha at the hands of Fjerdan soldiers was death. Gerald Broom and his witch hunters had taught her too well. As Nina followed Hildebrand into the cannery, the grind of machinery rattled her skull. The stink of salt cod overwhelming her, she wouldn't be sorry to leave Elling for a while. The whole Diverstaten was full of Grisha that her team, or Adric's team, really had helped rescue and bring to Elling. Since the end of the Civil War, King Nikolai had diverted funds and resources to support an underground network of informants that had existed for years in Fjerda, with the goal of helping Grisha living in secret to escape the country. They called themselves Ringsa, the Tree of Life, after the great ash sacred to death. Nina knew Adric had already received new intelligence from the group, and once the Verstaten was safely on its way to Ravka, Nina and the others would be free to head inland to locate more Grisha. Hildebrand led her to the office, shut the door behind them, then ran his fingers along the far wall. A click sounded in a second. Hidden door opened onto the Fiskstrad, the bustling street where fishmongers did their business and where a girl on her own might avoid the notice of the harbor police by simply disappearing into the crowd. Thank you, Nina said. We'll be sending more your way soon. Wait. Hildebrand snagged her arm before she could sleep into the sunshine. He hesitated and blurted out, Are you really her? The girl who bested Jarl Broom and left him bleeding on a Jerahum duck? Nina yanked her arm from his grip. She'd done what she had to do to free her friends and keep the secret of Judah Parem out of Fjerdan hands, but it was the drug that had made victory possible, and it had exacted an awful price, changing the course of Nina's life and the very nature of her Grisha power. If we'd never gone to the ice court, would Matthias still be alive? Would my heart still be whole? Pointless questions. There was no answer that would bring him back. Nina fixed Hildebrand with the withering glare she'd learned from Zoya Nazyalensky herself. I'm Mila Genderstadt, a young widow taking odd jobs to make ends meet and hoping to secure work as a translator. What kind of fool would pick a fight with Commander Jalbroom? Hildebrand opened his mouth, but Nina continued. And what kind of podge would risk compromising an agent's cover when so many lives are on the line? Nina turned her back on him and waded into the human tide. Dangerous. A man who lived his life in deep cover shouldn't be so careless. But Nina knew that loneliness could make you foolish, hungry to speak something other than lies. Hildebrand had lost his wife to Broom's men. The ruthless Driscoll, trained to hunt and kill Grisha. Since then, he'd become one of King Nikolai's most trusted operatives in Fjerda. Nina didn't doubt his loyalty, and his own safety relied on his direction. It took Nina less than 10 minutes to reach the address Hilbrand had given her, another cannery identical to the buildings bracketing it, except for the mural on its western side. At first glance, it looked like a pleasant scene set at the mouth of the Stelge, a group of fishermen casting their nets into the sea as happy villagers looked on beneath a setting sun. But if you knew what to look for, you might notice the white-haired girl in the crowd, her profile framed by the sun as if by a halo, Sancta Alina, the sun summoner, a sign that this warehouse was a place of refuge. The saints had never been popular among the people of the north until Alina Starkov had destroyed the fold. Then altars to her had begun to spring up in countries far outside Ravka. Fjerdan authorities had done their best to quash the cult of the Sun Saint, labeling it a religion of foreign influence. But still, little pockets of the faithful had bloomed gardens tended in secret. The stories of the saints, their miracles and martyrdoms had become a code for those sympathetic to Grisha. A rose for Sancta Elisabetta, a sun for Sancta Alina. A knight skewering a dragon on his lands might be Dagger the Bold from some children's tale, or it might be Sanct Juris, who had slain a great beast and been consumed by its flames. Even the tattoos that ran over Hilbrand's forearms were more than they seemed. A tangle of antlers, often worn by northern hunters but arranged in circular bands to symbolize the powerful amplifier Sancta Alina had once worn. Nina knocked on the cannery side door, and a moment later it swung open. Adric ushered her inside, his glam face pale beneath his freckles. His features were pleasant enough, but he maintained a relentlessly defeated demeanor that gave him the look of a melting candle. Instantly, Nina's eyes began to water. "I know," said Adric dismally. "Elling, if the cold doesn't kill you, the smell will. No fish smells like that. My eyes are burning. It's... Leigh? Vats of it. Apparently they'd preserve fish in it as some kind of local delicacy." She could almost hear Matthias' indignant protest. "It's delicious. Serve it on toast." Saints, she missed him. The ache of his absence felt like a hook lodged inside her heart. The hurt was always there, but in moments like this it was as if someone had seized hold of the line and pulled. Nina took a deep breath. Matthias would want her to focus on the mission. "They're here?" "They are, but here's the problem." She thought Adric seemed more morose than usual, and that was saying something. Nina saw Leonie first, bent over a makeshift crate desk beside a row of vats, a lantern near her elbow, her ordinarily cheerful face set in hard lines of determination. The twists of her hair were knotted in the Zemini style, and her dark brown skin was sheen with sweat. On the floor next to her she had cracked open her kit, pots of ink and powdered pigments, rolls of paper and parchment, but that made no sense. The immigration document should have been long since finished. Understanding came as Nina's eyes adjusted and she saw the figures huddled in the shadows. A bearded man in a muskrat-collared coat and a far older man with a thick thatch of white hair. Two little boys peeked out from behind them, eyes wide and frightened, 4 fugitives. There should have been 7. Leonie glanced up at Nina, then at the fugitives, Grisha, offering them a warm smile. "She's a friend, don't worry." They didn't look reassured. "Germanen and Denham Dan Naskel," Nina said, the traditional Fjerdan greeting to travelers. "Be welcome and wait out the storm." It wasn't totally appropriate to their situation, but it was the best she could offer. The man seemed to relax at the words, though the children still looked terrified. "Granem and Karjening Grant Juntonter Kelhom," the older man said in traditional reply. "I thank you and bring only gratitude to your home." Nina hoped that wasn't true. Ravka didn't need gratitude. It needed more Grisha. It needed soldiers. She could only imagine what Zoya would make of these recruits. "Where are the other 3? Nina asked Adric. "They didn't meet their handler. Captured? Probably. Maybe they had a change of heart," said Leonie, opening a bottle of something blue. She could always be counted on to find a positive outcome, no matter how unlikely. "It isn't easy to leave all you love behind. It is when all you love smells of fish and despair," Adric grumbled. "The immigration papers?" Nina asked Leonie as gently as she could. "I'm doing my best," Leonie replied. "You said women don't travel alone, so I wrote up the indentures as families, and now we're short 2 wives and a daughter. Not good at all, especially with Kafiks crawling all over the docks." But Leonie was one of the most talented fabricators Nina had met. In recent years, the Fjerdan government had begun to watch their borders more closely and prohibit travel for their citizens. The authorities were on the lookout for Grisha attempting to escape. But they also wanted to slow the tide of people traveling across the true sea to Novy Zem seeking better jobs and warmer weather. People willing to brave a new world to live free of the threat of a war. Many Ravgans had done the same. Ferris officials especially didn't like to let able-bodied men and prospective soldiers emigrate and had made the necessary papers almost impossible to fake. That was why Leonie was here. She was no ordinary forger, but a fabricator who could match inks and paper at the molecular level. Nina pulled a clean handkerchief from her pocket and dabbed Leonie's brow. "You can manage this." She shook her head. "I need more time." "We don't have it." Nina wished she didn't have to say so. "We might," Leonie said heavily. She had spent most of her life in Novy Zem before traveling to Ravka to train, and like many fabricators, she had never seen combat. Fabricators hadn't even been taught to fight until Alina Starkov had led the Second Army. "We can send word to the Versata and ask them to wait until—" "It's no good," Nina said. "The ship has to be out of port by sunset. Captain Berger is planning one of his surprise raids tonight." Leonie let out a long breath, then bobbed her chin at the man in the muskrat-colored coat. "Nina, we'll have to pass you off as his wife." It wasn't ideal. Nina had been working at the harbor for weeks now, and there was a chance she'd been recognized. But it was a risk worth taking. "What's your name?" she asked the man. "Enoch." "These are your sons?" He nodded. "And this is my father." "You're all Grisha?" "Just me and my boys." "Well, lucky you, Enoch. You're about to acquire me as a wife. I enjoy long naps and short engagements, and I prefer the left side of the bed." Enoch blinked, and his father looked positively scandalized. Ganya had tailored Nina to look as Feridan as possible, but the demure ways of northern women were far more exhausting to master. Nina tried not to pace as Leonie worked, and Adric spoke quietly to the fugitives. What had happened to the other three Grisha? Nina picked up the discarded immigration documents, priceless sets of papers that would never be used. 2 women and a girl of 16 missing. Missing? Had they decided a life in hiding was better than an uncertain future in a foreign land? Or had they been taken prisoner? Were they somewhere out there, scared and alone? Nina frowned at the papers. Were these women really from Kejerut? Leonie nodded. It seemed simpler to keep the town the same. Anek's father made a sign of warning in the air. It was an old gesture meant to wash away evil thoughts with the strength of Gel's waters. Girls go missing from Kejerut. Nina shivered as the strange sighing filled her head again. Kejerut was only a few miles from Kafval, but it all might mean nothing. She rubbed her arms, trying to dispel the sudden cold that settled into her. She wished Hilbrand hadn't mentioned Jarl Broom, despite all she'd been through. It was a name that still had power over her. Nina had defeated him and his men. Her friends had blown Broom's secret laboratory to bits and stolen his most valuable hostage. He should have been disgraced. It would have meant an end to his command of the Druskel and his brutal experiments with the Jurdapadim and Grisha prisoners. And yet somehow, Broom had survived and continued to thrive in the highest ranks of the Fjerdan military. "I should have killed him when I had a chance." "You showed mercy, Nina. Never regret that." But mercy was a luxury Matthias could afford. He was dead, after all. It seems rude to mention that, my love. "What do you expect from a Ravgan? Besides, Broom and I aren't done. Is that why you're here?" "I'm here to bury you, Matthias," she thought, and the voice in her head went silent. It always did when she let herself remember what she'd lost. Nina tried to shake the thought of Matthias' body preserved by fabricator craft, bound up in ropes and tarp like ballast, hidden beneath blankets and crepes on the sledge that waited back at their boarding house. She'd sworn she would take him home, that she would bury his body in the land he loved so that he could find his way to his god. And for nearly 2 months they had traveled with that body, dragged the grim burden from town to town. She had had countless opportunities to lay him to rest and say her goodbyes. So why hadn't she taken them? Nina knew Leonie and Adric didn't want to raise the issue with her, but they couldn't be thrilled to be members of a months-long funeral procession. "It has to be the right place, my love. You'll know it when you see it." But would she? Or would she just keep marching, unable to let him go? Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, signaling the end of the workday. "We're out of time," said Adric. Leonie did not protest, just stretched and said, "Come dry the ink." Adric waved his hand, directing a warm gust of squalor air over the documents. "It's nice to be useful. I'm sure you'll come in very handy when we need to fly kites." They exchanged a smile, and Nina felt a stab of irritation, then wanted to kick herself for being so unfair. Just because she was miserable didn't mean everyone else should be. But as they all set out toward the docks with the fugitives in tow, Adric began giving them instructions, and Nina felt her temper spike again. Though he was her commanding officer, she lost the habit of taking orders during her time in Ketterdam. Leonie and Adric led the way to the Verstaden. They were conspicuous, but in a way that fit with the tumult of the harbor. A Zemanai woman and her husband, a merchant couple with business on the docks, Nina slipped her arm through Annox and hung back slightly with her new family, keeping a careful distance. She rolled her shoulders, trying to focus, but that only served to sharpen the edge of her tension. Her body felt wrong. Back in Os Alta, Genya Safin had tailored her to the very brink of what her skills would allow. Nina's new hair was slick, straight, and nearly ice white. Her eyes were narrower, the green of her irises changed to the pale blue of a northern glacier. Her cheekbones were higher, her brows lower, her mouth broader. "I look uncooked," she complained when she'd seen the milky depth of her new pallor. Genya had been unmoved. "You look fierdan." Nina's thighs were still solid, her waist still thick, but Genya had pushed back Nina's ears, flattened her breasts, and even changed the set of her shoulders. The process had been painful at times, as the bones was altered, but Nina didn't care. She didn't want to be the girl she'd been, the girl Matthias had loved. If Genya would make her someone new on the outside, maybe Nina's heart would oblige and beat with the new rhythm too. Of course, it hadn't worked. The Ferdin saw Mila Janderstad, but she was still Nina Zenik, legendary Grisha, and unrepentant killer. She was still the girl who craved waffles and who cried herself to sleep at night when she reached for Matthias and found no one there. Enoch's arm danced beneath her fingers, and she saw that 2 members of the harbor police were waiting at the gangway that led onto the Versaten. "It's going to be fine," murmured Nina. "We'll see you all the way into the ship." "And then what?" Enoch asked, voice trembling. "Once we're out of the bay, I'll take a rowboat back ashore with the others. You and your family will travel on to Ravka, where you'll be free to live without fear." "Will they take my boys? Will they take them away to that special school?" "Only if that's what you wish," said Nina. "We're not monsters, not any more than you are. Now hush." But part of her wanted to turn around and stride right back to the safe house when she saw that one of the guards was Berger's champion thug, Casper. She tucked her face into her coat collar. "Zemini?" Casper asked, glancing at Leonie. She nodded in reply. Casper gestured to Adric's missing arm. "How'd you lose it?" "Farming accident," Adric replied in Fjerdan. He didn't know much of the language, but he could speak bits and pieces with a Ravkan accent. And this particular lie was one he told many times. Nearly everyone they met asked about his arm as soon as they saw the pin sleeve. He'd had to leave the mechanical arm David Kostic had fashioned for him back in the capital because it was too recognizable as Grisha handwork. The guards asked them the usual series of questions. How long had they been in the country? Where had they visited during their stay? Did they have knowledge of foreign agents working inside Fjerda's borders? Then waved them through with little ceremony. Now it was Anok's turn. She gave his arm a squeeze and he stepped forward. Nina could see the sweat beading at his temple, feel the slight tremor in his hands. If she could have snatched the papers away and given them to the guards herself, she would have. But Ferdinand wives always deferred to their husbands. The Grand family. Casper peered at the papers for an comfortably long time. "Indentures? Where will you be working?" "Drew the farm near Cofton," said Anok. "Hard work. Too hard for the old father there." "He'll be in the main house with the boys," said Anok. "He's gifted with a needle and thread, and the boys can be runners until they're old enough for the fields." Nina was impressed by how easily Anok lied, but if he'd spent his life hiding as a Grisha, he must have had plenty of practice. "Indentures are difficult to come by," mused Casper. "My uncle secured them for us. And why is a life breaking your back in Novi Zem so preferable to one spent doing honest work in Fjerda?" "I'd live and die on the ice if I had my way," said Anok with such a fervor Nina knew he was speaking the truth. "But jobs are scarce, and my son's lungs don't like the cold." "Hard times all around." Guards turned to Nina. "And what will you do in Cofton?" "Sue, if I'm able. Work the fields if need be." She dipped her head. She could be subtle, dang it, no matter what Zoya thought, as my husband wishes. Casper could continue to look at the papers, waiting, and Nina nudged Anok with her elbow, looking as if he might be sick all over the docks. Anok reached into his pocket and drew out a packet stuffed with the Fjerdan currency. He handed it to Casper, who lifted the brooch, and the guard's face broke into a satisfied smile. They remembered him watching the gulls stare at the creature chained in the sun, their beaks blooded with bits of skin and hair. Casper waved them through. "May Jel watch over you." But they hadn't set a foot on the gangway when Nina heard a voice say, "Just a moment." Berger. Couldn't they catch a bit of luck? The sun hadn't even been set. They should have had more time. Anok's father hesitated on the gangway next to Leonie, and Adric gave Nina the barest shake of his head. The message was clear. Don't start trouble. Nina thought of the other Grisha fugitives packed into the hold of the ship and held her tongue. Berger stood between Casper and the other guard. He was short for a Fierdan. His shoulders sloped like a bull's, and his uniform fit so impeccably that Nina suspected it had been professionally tailored. She kept behind Anak and whispered to the boys, "Go to your grandfather." But they didn't move. "It was a hard day's travel for all of us," Anak said to Berger amiably. "The boys are eager to get settled. I'll see your papers first. We just showed them to your man." Casper's eyes aren't nearly as cute as mine. But the money, what money was that? Casper and the other guard shrugged. "I don't know about any money." Reluctantly, Anak handed over the papers. "Perhaps," said his father, "we could reach a new arrangement." "Stay where you are," ordered Berger, "but our ship is about to depart." Nina tried from behind Anak's shoulder. Berger glanced at the first and then at the boys tugging restlessly on their father's hands. "They're going to be a handful cooped up for a sea journey." Then he looked back at Anak and Nina. Funny the way they cling to their father and not their mother. "They're scared," said Nina. "You're frightening them." Berger's cold eyes traveled over Adric and Leonie. He smacked the indenture papers against his gloved palm. "That ship isn't going anywhere, not until we've seen every inch of it." He gestured to Casper. "There's something off here." "Signal the others." "Oh my gosh." Casper reached for his whistle, but before he could draw breath to blow, Nina's arm shot out. Two slender bone shards flew from the sheets soon into the forearms of her coat. Everything she wore was laced with them. The darts lodged in Casper's windpipe, and the sharp wheeze squeaked from his mouth. Nina twisted her fingers, and the bone shards rotated. The guard dropped the dog, clawing at his neck. Casper, Berger, and the other guard drew their guns. Nina shoved Anak and the children behind her. "Get them on the boat," she growled. "Don't start trouble." She hadn't, but she intended to finish it. "I know you," Berger said, training his gun on her, his eyes hard and bright as river stones. "That's a bold statement." "You work at the salmon cannery, one of the barrel girls. I knew there was something wrong about you." Nina could help but smile. "Plenty of things." "Mila," Adric said warningly, using her cover name as if it mattered now. The time for bribes and negotiations was over. She liked these moments best, when the secrets fell away. Nina flicked her fingers. The bone shards lodged from Casper's windpipe and slid back into the hidden sheaths on her arm. He flopped on the dock, his lips wet with blood, his eyes rolling back in his head as he struggled for breath. "Drush," Berger hissed. "Which?" "I don't know how to say. How do you read that?" "I don't like that word," Nina said, advancing. "Call me Grisha. Call me Zoa. Call me Death if you like." Berger laughed. "Two guns are pointed at you. You think you can kill us both before one of us gets a shot off?" "But you're already dying, Captain," she crooned gently. The bone armor the fabricators had made for her in Os Alta was a comfort and had proven useful more times than she could count. But sometimes she would feel death already waiting her targets. Like now in this man who stood before her, his chin jutting forward, the brass buttons on his fine uniform gleaming. He was younger than she'd realized, his golden stubble patchy in places as if he couldn't grow a beard. Should she be sorry for him? She was not. "Nina," Mathias' voice chiding, disappointed. Perhaps she was doomed to stand on docks and murder Ferdans. There were worse fates. "You know it, don't you?" she went on. "Somewhere inside your body knows." She drew closer. "That cough you can't shake, the pain you told yourself was a bruised rib, the way food has lost its savor." In the day's fading light, she saw fear come into Berger's face, a shadow falling. It fed her. And a strange sigh inside her grew louder, a whispering chorus that rose, as if in encouragement, even as Mathias' voice receded. "You work in a harbor," she continued. "You know how easy it is for rats to get into the walls, to eat a place up from the inside." Berger's pistol hand dipped slightly. He was watching her now, closely. Not with his sharp policeman's eyes, but with the gaze of a man who didn't want to listen, but who had to, who must know the end to the story. "The enemy is already inside you. The bad cells eating the others slowly, right there in your lungs. Unusual, in a man so young." "You're dying, Captain Berger," she said softly, almost kindly. "I'm just going to help you along." The captain seemed to wake from a trance. He raised his pistol, but he was too slow. Nina's power already had hold of that sick cluster of cells within him, and dead, unfurled, a terrible multiplication. He might have lived another year, maybe two, but now the cells became a black tide, destroying everything in their path. Captain Berger released a low moan and toppled. Before the remaining guard could react, Nina flicked her fingers and drove a shard of bone through his heart. The dogs were curiously still. She could hear the waves lapping against the restaurant's hull, the high calls of seabirds inside her, the whispering chorus leapt, the sound almost joyful. Then one of Enoch's boys began to cry. For a moment, Nina had stood alone with Detz on the docks, two weary travelers, long-time companions, but now she saw the way the others were watching her. The Grisha fugitives, Adric and Leone, even the ship's captain and his crew leaning over the railing of the ship. Maybe she should have cared. Maybe some part of her did. Nina's powers was frightening. A corruption of the heart-render power she had been born with, twisted by Param. And still, it had become dear to her. Matthias had accepted the dark thing in her and encouraged her to do the same, but what Nina felt was not acceptance. It was love. Adric sighed. I'm not going to miss this town. He called up to the ship's crew. Stop tearing and help us get the bodies on board. We'll dispose of them when we reach open water. Some men deserve your mercy, Nina. Of course, Matthias. Nina watched Enoch and his father lift Birger's body. I'll let you know when I meet one of them. Adric held his tongue until they were in the little rowboat headed back to the shore. They would make land in one of the coves north of Elling and hike back to their lodgings to collect their things. They're going to be trouble when those men are discovered missing, he said. Nina felt like a child being scolded, and she didn't appreciate it. Good thing we'll be long gone. We won't be able to operate out of this port anymore, added Leone. They're going to tighten security. Don't take a side. I'm not taking sides, said Leone. I'm just making an observation. Did you want to give up the whole ship? Did you want to give up the Grisha in the hold? Adric adjusted the rudder. Nina, I'm not angry at you. I'm trying to figure out what we do next. She leaned into her oars. You're a little angry with me. No one's angry, said Leone, matching Nina's pace. We freed a ship full of Grisha from that horrible place, and it's not like Birger and his Scalfix goons didn't have plenty of enemies in the docks. They could have run into trouble with anyone during their surprise inspection. I call this a victory. Of course you do, said Adric. If you can find a way to put a sunny spin on something, you will. It was true. Leone was like a cheer in a bottle, and not even Mazifiada had dimmed her shine. Are you actually humming? Adric had once asked incredulously when they'd been forced to spend an hour digging their sledge out of the mud. How can you be so relentlessly optimistic? It isn't healthy. Leone had stopped humming to give the question her full consideration as she tried to coax her horse to pull. I suppose it's because I almost died as a child. When the gods give you another look at the world, you must enjoy it. Adric had barely raised a brow. I've been shot, stabbed, bayoneted, and had my arm torn off by a shadow demon. It's done nothing for my disposition. It was true. If Leone was a sunshine walking, Adric was a doleful storm cloud too put upon to actually rain. Now he cast his eyes at the spangle of stars above them as he steered the rowboat towards shore. The Versatan will have to be repainted, given new documentation and a new history. We'll have to shift our operations to another port. Maybe here. Nina gripped her oars. King Nikolai had sent the Versatan to dock and trade in Elling for the better part of a year before Adric's team had begun their mission. It was a familiar vessel that had drawn scarce attention. A perfect cover. Had she acted too hastily? Captain Birger had been a greedy man, not a righteous man. Maybe she'd wanted to see him dead a little too much. But she'd been like this since Matthias died. Fine one moment, then ready to snarl and snap like a wild thing. No, like a wounded animal. Like a wounded animal, for a time she had gone to ground. She'd spent months at the little palace, rekindling old friendships, eating familiar food, sitting by the fire in the hole of the golden dome, trying to remember who she'd been before Matthias, before a glowering Fjerdan had disrupted her life with this unexpected honor, before she'd known that a witch hunter might shed his hate and fear and become the boy she loved, before he'd been taken from her. But if there was a way back to the girl she had been, she hadn't found it. And now she was here in Matthias' country, in this cold, hostile place. We'll go south, Leone was saying. It's only going to get colder. We can work our way back here in a few months when good old Captain Birger has been forgotten. It was a reasonable plan, but the whispering chorus in Nina's head rose, and she found herself saying, We should go to Kitchener, to Gaffval. The fugitives who didn't make it to the safe house didn't change their minds. You know they were most likely captured, said Adric. Tell them the truth, my love. Yes, I do, said Nina, but you heard what the old man said. Girls go missing from Ketcheruk. Tell them you hear the dead calling. You don't know that, Matthias. It was one thing to hear her dead lover's voice, quite another to claim she could sense. What exactly? She didn't know, but she didn't think the whispering in her head was just imagination. Something was pulling her east to the river cities. There was another thing, said Nina. The woman I worked with claimed the river up near Gaffal had gone sour, that the town was cursed. Now she had Adric's attention. What had she once done, said to Jasper back in Ketterdam. Do you know the best way to find Grisha who don't want to be found? Look for miracles and listen to bedtime stories. Tales of witches and wondrous happenings, warnings about cursed places. They were signposts to things that ordinary people didn't understand. Sometimes there was little more to it than local lore. But sometimes there were Grisha hiding in these places, disguising their powers, living in fear. Grisha they could help. Tell them the truth, Nina. Nina rubbed her arms. You're like a dog with a bone, Matthias. A wolf. Did I ever tell you about the way Trassel would destroy my boots if I didn't tie them up in a branch out of his reach? He had. Matthias had told her all kinds of stories to keep her distracted when she'd been recovering from the influence of Param. He'd kept her alive. Why hadn't she been able to do the same for him? Curses, spoiled rivers, continued Nina. If it's nothing, we head south and I'll buy you both a good dinner. In Ferda, said Adric. I won't hold you to it. But if I'm right, fine, said Adric said. I'll send word to Ravka that we need to establish a new port and we'll head to Gaffal. The whispers quieted to a gentle murmur. Leonie hesitated. There's open land out there. Beautiful country. You could find a place for him. Nina looked out at the dark water, at the lights glittering on shore. Find a place for him. As if Matthias were an old armor or a plant that needed just the right amount of sun. His place is with me, but that wasn't true anymore. Matthias was gone, his body was all that remained, and without Leonie's careful maintenance, it would have long ago given way to rot. Nina felt the press of tears in the back of her throat. She would not cry. They'd been in Ferda 2 months. They'd helped nearly 40 Grisha escape Verdenrul. They'd traversed hundreds of miles of barren field and snowy plain. There had been plenty of places to lay Matthias to rest. Now it had to be done. It would be done, and one of her promises to him would be fulfilled. I'll see to it, she said. One more thing, said Adric, and she could hear the command in his voice, so different from his usual dismal tone. Our job is to find recruits and refugees. Whatever we discover in Gaffal, we are not there to start a war. We gather intelligence, open communication, provide a path to escape for those who want it, and that's all. That's the plan, said Nina. She touched her fingers to the spikes of bone in her gloves. But plans could change.